Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Laughter in the Woods. The Johnson family, Mark, his wife Claire, and their two children, Sam and Lily, had been looking forward to a weekend escape from the bustle of city life. They chose a remote forest campground known for its picturesque beauty and isolation. Nestled miles away from the nearest road, the site promised tranquility and quality family time. The first day was idyllic. The family hiked through dense woods, cooked dinner over a crackling campfire, and shared stories beneath a canopy of stars. The children laughed as Mark attempted to tell spooky stories, but stumbled over his words, making the tales more comedic than frightening. As the night deepened, the forest grew eerily silent, the kind of silence that amplifies every rustle, every twig snap, and every unidentifiable sound. Claire remarked on how quiet it was, joking that it was almost too peaceful. Around midnight, the laughter began. At first, it was faint, distant, and almost musical. It floated on the crisp night air, barely audible over the crackling embers of their dying fire. Mark chuckled nervously. "Sounds like someone else is enjoying their trip," he said, trying to brush it off. Claire nodded, though her expression betrayed a hint of unease. But the laughter didn't stop. It grew louder, more distinct. What initially sounded like one voice turned into many. Men, women, and children, all laughing in an unnatural harmony. The sound seemed to come from all directions, bouncing between the trees and enveloping the campsite. Mark grabbed a flashlight and scanned the woods, the beam cutting through the darkness but revealing nothing. The forest floor and tree line were still, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing in the emptiness. There was no response, just more laughter, now laced with a mocking edge. "Dad, I don't like this," whispered Lily, clutching her stuffed bear tightly. Sam, trying to appear brave, stood close to his sister, his wide eyes betraying his fear. Claire pulled the children closer, her voice steady but strained. "Mark, maybe we should go back to the car," she suggested. Mark hesitated. The car was a 20-minute hike through dense forest in the dark. He didn't want to risk leading his family into the woods with whoever or whatever was out there. The laughter suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Even the wind seemed to vanish, and the forest felt lifeless. "Let's get inside the tent," Mark said, his voice firm. They hurriedly retreated into their large family tent, zipping it up tightly as though the thin nylon walls could offer some protection. Mark kept the flashlight in hand, its beam illuminating the tent's interior. Minutes dragged on like hours. The silence was suffocating, every creak of the tent fabric making them jump. Just as Claire began to suggest that the laughter might have been a prank, it started again. This time it was right outside the tent. The laughter was different now, hollow, echoing, and far too close. It wasn't just around the tent. It was above them, as though coming from the treetops. Sam let out a small cry, and Claire held him close, trying to comfort him even as her own hands trembled. Mark unzipped the tent slightly and shone the flashlight out, the beam sweeping the area. The forest was empty. No campers, no pranksters, nothing. But the laughter continued, growing louder and more chaotic, like a crescendo in a nightmare symphony. Suddenly it stopped again. This time, the silence was broken by a single word whispered directly outside the tent. Leave. That was enough. Mark didn't wait to see what might happen next. Grab your things, we're leaving, he barked, his voice trembling. They packed only the essentials, throwing them into their backpacks and extinguishing the fire as quickly as possible. Mark led the way with the flashlight, Claire clutching Lily's hand while Sam held on her other side. As they made their way through the forest toward the car, the laughter resumed, following them. It darted through the trees, echoing unnaturally. Occasionally, it would sound impossibly close, as though someone were whispering in their ears, only for them to see nothing when they turned. When they finally reached the car, Mark fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. He managed to unlock the doors, and the family piled in. As they sped away, the laughter faded, replaced by the comforting hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. The Johnsons never returned to that campground. Later, when Mark tried to research the area, he discovered a chilling history. Decades ago, a small settlement had existed near the campsite. According to local lore, the entire settlement vanished overnight, leaving behind no trace except for reports of eerie laughter in the woods. To this day, the Johnsons can't explain what they experienced, but one thing is certain. They'll never forget the night they were surrounded by the laughter in the woods. Story 2. The Tent Shaker. Matthew had always prided himself on his love for solitude. He was an experienced solo camper who often ventured deep into the wilderness, seeking solace in the untouched beauty of nature. This time, he had decided to tackle a remote section of the Appalachian Trail that was rarely visited by other hikers. The journey had been challenging, but rewarding. The views of sprawling forests, jagged cliffs, and mist-covered valleys had made the strenuous hike worthwhile. After a long day of trekking, Matthew found a small clearing just off the trail. The spot was perfect, a level patch of ground surrounded by towering pines, with a small stream nearby for water. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he set up his tent, started a modest fire, and cooked a simple meal. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves as a light breeze passed through the forest. When darkness fully enveloped the woods, Matthew extinguished his fire and crawled into his tent. The quiet was profound, almost oppressive, but he was used to it. Pulling his sleeping bag tightly around him, he drifted off to sleep. Sometime deep in the night, Matthew was jolted awake. His tent was shaking violently, as though someone or something was grabbing the fabric and pulling it from side to side. Disoriented and groggy, he froze for a moment, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cutting through the silence. The shaking stopped immediately. He strained his ears, listening for any sound of movement outside the tent. The forest was eerily quiet, too quiet. There were no footsteps, no rustling of leaves, not even the chirping of insects. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. Heart pounding, Matthew grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent door in one quick motion. He shone the beam of light into the darkness, scanning the area around his campsite. There was nothing. The clearing was empty, and the soft dirt and moss surrounding his tent were undisturbed. No tracks, no signs of anyone or anything having been there. He stepped outside, the chill of the night air biting at his skin. His breath came out in visible puffs as he swept the flashlight in wide arcs. Still, there was nothing. The woods stood silent and still, the towering pines casting long, skeletal shadows under the moonlight. Matthew retreated into his tent, zipping it up tightly and clutching his flashlight like a weapon. He tried to convince himself it had been the wind or some kind of animal brushing against the tent, but deep down, he knew neither explanation fit. The shaking had been deliberate, forceful, almost aggressive. The rest of the night passed in a tense, sleepless haze. Every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves made Matthew's heart race, but nothing else happened. When dawn finally broke, he emerged from the tent to examine the area in the light of day. The ground was still undisturbed. If someone or something had been there, it had left no trace. Matthew packed up his gear in record time, his usual appreciation for the wilderness replaced by an overwhelming urge to leave. As he hiked back toward the trail, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow, every distant sound seemed to press in on him. Months later, Matthew shared his experience with a fellow camper who was familiar with the Appalachian Trail. The man listened intently before nodding. "You're not the first to mention something like that happening out there," he said. "People talk about an old legend, something about a spirit or entity that doesn't like visitors in its woods. It doesn't hurt anyone, but it makes sure you know you're not welcome." Matthew never camped alone again. Story 3. The Vanishing Campmate. A group of 5 friends had been planning their camping trip for months. They were seasoned hikers, used to the rugged trails and remote spots in the mountains. And this trip to a secluded lake in the Sierra Nevada was supposed to be just another adventure. They had hiked for hours to reach the lake, nestled in a valley surrounded by towering pines and granite cliffs. It was the perfect spot, isolated and serene. No one had been around for miles. The first night passed without incident. They set up their tents, made a campfire, and spent the evening sharing stories and enjoying the peace of the wilderness. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even, but things would soon take a strange turn. Their friend, Jack, was a seasoned camper and outdoorsman. He had been on countless trips before, and everyone in the group looked up to him for his experience in the wilderness. He was the first to suggest going out to collect firewood for the next evening. It was still light out, so he told the group he'd only be gone for an hour at most. They didn't think much of it. Jack had always taken solo hikes for firewood without incident. As the evening wore on, the group continued to relax around the fire, joking and talking. But as the sun began to dip behind the mountain peaks, they started to wonder where Jack had gone. Time passed, and the fire flickered low. He still hadn't returned. They called out for him, but there was no answer. A chill began to settle over them, but they tried to brush it off, telling themselves he had probably just wandered a little farther than usual. They had all done it before, losing track of time in the woods. But as the night wore on and Jack didn't return, their concern grew. After an hour, they decided to search for him. They grabbed flashlights and began combing the area around the campsite, calling his name and shining lights into the dense woods. The night was quiet, too quiet, with only the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant splash of water from the lake breaking the silence. They checked the trail leading away from the camp, the rocks near the shore, and even the forest edge. They found no sign of Jack. The hours passed, and they began to feel the unease growing in their chests. They retraced their steps, looking for any sign of Jack, any clue that might explain where he had gone. But it was as though he had vanished into thin air. His footprints were visible at the campsite, but they seemed to just end abruptly at the edge of the trees, as if he had been picked up and carried away. By the time midnight rolled around, panic had fully set in. They split up into pairs to cover more ground, each flashlight beam cutting through the dark forest. They yelled for Jack, hoping for a response, but only the wind carried their voices. As dawn began to break over the lake, the group reluctantly returned to camp, exhausted and scared. They hoped to find something, anything, that would explain his sudden disappearance. But there was nothing. Jack's gear, the same gear he had left behind that evening, was still sitting in its place by the fire pit, untouched, just as it had been when he left hours ago. His jacket, his knife, and even his pack were exactly where they had been. The only thing missing was him. The group searched the area one more time. They checked the nearby creek, scoured the shoreline, and even climbed the rocks surrounding the lake, hoping to spot some sign of Jack. But it was as though he had never been there at all. There were no tracks, no broken branches, no sign of struggle. It was as if he had simply vanished from the earth. They waited for another day, hoping Jack would wander back to camp, disoriented or injured. But as hours turned into the second day, and still no sign of him, they knew something was terribly wrong. They reported his disappearance to the nearest ranger station, and a search and rescue team was dispatched to comb the area. Helicopters flew over the forest, and ground teams searched the trails and the rugged terrain around the lake. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign of Jack. The search party found nothing. No clothing, no tracks, no clue as to what had happened to him. The only thing they discovered was a strange absence in the woods. A deep, unnerving quiet that seemed to grow thicker the longer they searched. The search was called off after a few weeks, and the group of friends was left to wonder what had happened to their campmate. Jack was never found. Years later, they returned to the same area for a memorial of sorts. The pain of losing their friend still lingered, and they couldn't shake the strange feeling that something in those woods had taken him. There had been no answers, no explanation for his disappearance. They had hiked those trails for years, but now, every step they took felt different. The forest, once familiar, felt like a place that hid its secrets well. They couldn't shake the sensation that they were being watched, just as they had felt the night Jack vanished. And though they would never forget their missing friend, they could never return to that lake, that campsite, without feeling as though something unnatural had happened there. Something far darker than they could comprehend. The truth of what happened to Jack would remain lost in the woods, where he disappeared without a trace. Story 4. The Silent Hikers. It was a bright, an early morning when Jake and Sarah set out for their weekend hiking trip in the remote parts of the Colorado Rockies. They had planned this for weeks, an escape from their busy lives to enjoy the peace and solitude the mountains had to offer. Their destination was a secluded campsite near a hidden lake, nestled deep within the forest, miles from the nearest trailhead. The day began as any hiking trip does. Clear skies, the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath their boots, and the peaceful sounds of the forest surrounding them. Jake, always the more experienced hiker, led the way, while Sarah followed behind, snapping photos of the towering pines and the occasional deer that darted through the brush. The hike was long but manageable, and as the hours passed, they made good progress, crossing streams and navigating rocky paths with ease. By midday, they reached a particularly dense section of forest. The trees were tall and close together, casting long, shadowy shapes across the trail. The air grew cooler, and the chirping of birds seemed to quiet. As they continued on, Sarah noticed something odd. Up ahead, there was a group of hikers, at least 6 or 7 people, walking in a single file along the narrow path, heading toward them. At first glance, they seemed like any other group of outdoor enthusiasts, but as Sarah squinted to get a better look, she noticed something unsettling. The group was moving slowly, almost mechanically, without any chatter or sounds. No one was talking, no one was laughing, not even the shuffle of boots in the dirt. It was as though they were walking in perfect silence. "Hey, do you see them?" Sarah whispered to Jake, her voice laced with curiosity. Jake slowed his pace and nodded without saying anything, his eyes focused on the group ahead. As the group of hikers drew closer, Sarah noticed their faces. They were all pale, unnaturally pale, almost as if they hadn't seen the sun in years. Their expressions were blank, their eyes fixed straight ahead, never glancing to either side. It was as though they were in a trance, moving forward with no regard for the world around them. Jake and Sarah stood to the side of the trail to let the group pass, but to their surprise, not a single one of the hikers acknowledged them. No nod of the head, no greeting, not even a slight shift in their gaze. They simply passed by, one after another, in perfect unison. The eerie silence of the encounter made the hairs on Sarah's neck stand on end. As the last of the hikers passed, Sarah felt a strange, unease settle in her chest. "What the hell was that about?" she muttered under her breath. Jake didn't reply immediately. He just shook his head, as if trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. "I don't know, but let's keep moving." The pair continued on their hike, but the silence lingered in the air. They tried to dismiss the strange encounter, telling themselves that maybe it was just a group that wanted to enjoy the peace of the mountains and didn't feel the need to speak. After all, hikers weren't always the most social, and it wasn't completely out of the ordinary to see groups moving in silence. But as they approached their destination, their unease grew. They were only a few miles from their campsite, yet the forest felt different now, darker and quieter. The usual sounds of wildlife had faded, and the air felt heavy, as if it were holding its breath. When they reached the clearing where they planned to set up camp, something strange caught Sarah's attention. She scanned the area, expecting to see other campsites nearby. After all, this spot was popular with other hikers. But there was nothing. No tents, no campfires, not even a faint trail of footsteps leading into the woods. "Jake, where are the other campsites?" she asked, her voice rising in confusion. "This is the spot, right? It's supposed to be crowded." Jake furrowed his brow and looked around, his expression shifting from casual to concerned. "Yeah, it should be, but there's nothing here. No signs of anyone else." They both began to search the area, but they found no other campsites. No remnants of campfires or discarded equipment. Nothing. The entire area was eerily devoid of any sign that other people had been there, let alone camped there recently. "We must have taken a wrong turn," Jake muttered, but there was a note of doubt in his voice. They had been following the trail on their map, and everything seemed to match. But the lack of any other hikers or campsites was starting to unnerve him. Sarah pulled out her phone to check the map, but the signal was weak, almost non-existent. They both stood in the clearing, surrounded by the silence of the forest, the weight of the strange encounter with the silent hikers pressing down on them. "Let's take a look at the trail again," Jake suggested. "Maybe we missed something." They retraced their steps, but when they reached the section of the trail where they had passed the hikers, there was no sign of them. No footprints in the dirt, no broken branches, no evidence that anyone had walked through recently. It was as though the hikers had never been there at all. Confused and uneasy, Jake and Sarah decided to leave the area and find a new spot for the night. As they hiked back, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The dense trees seemed to close in around them, and every sound in the woods felt amplified, like the forest itself was alive and listening. They finally made it back to the main trail and decided to camp near a small stream, far from the clearing they had initially planned on. But even as they set up their tent and started a fire, they couldn't shake the image of the silent hikers, their pale faces and empty expressions, moving in perfect, eerie synchrony. That night, they heard nothing but the sounds of the stream and the crackling of their fire. No footsteps, no voices, nothing. They tried to sleep, but the eerie quiet of the forest made it nearly impossible. Every time Sarah closed her eyes, she saw those hikers walking past, their blank faces never turning to acknowledge her. In the morning, they packed up quickly, eager to leave the unsettling wilderness behind. As they hiked back down the trail to the nearest town, they passed other hikers, normal hikers, chatting and laughing as they made their way through the forest. But neither Sarah nor Jake would ever forget the eerie silence of the group they had encountered. And when they got home, they tried to find information about that area, the hiking trails, and any strange occurrences. They found nothing. There was no record of other hikers disappearing, no mention of strange sightings in that part of the forest. The incident remained a mystery. The silent hikers had passed through their lives like a shadow, leaving behind a lingering sense of unease that neither of them could ever fully shake. Story 5. The Eerie Handprints. It was meant to be a peaceful weekend getaway. Megan and Jeff, a couple from the city, had decided to take a break from their busy lives and head out to a desolate canyon for some solitude. They'd spent the last few months working long hours at their jobs, and the idea of a quiet camping trip in the wilderness sounded like the perfect way to unwind. They had chosen a remote canyon, far off the beaten path. It was one of those places where the nearest town was miles away, and the nearest person even farther. They set up camp on a small, secluded flat area near a dry creek bed, surrounded by towering red rock walls. The only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the soft wind that moved through the canyon, creating a feeling of perfect isolation. The first day went smoothly. They had a small fire, cooked some simple meals, and spent the evening talking under a blanket of stars. It was the kind of night you dream about when you're stuck in the hustle of city life, surrounded by the peace of the natural world. As the fire dwindled and the temperature dropped, they crawled into their tent, zipped themselves in, and drifted off to sleep. That night, however, the silence of the canyon was broken by something unsettling. Megan awoke in the middle of the night, suddenly alert, but she couldn't put her finger on why. She strained her ears, listening for any unusual sounds. The only thing she could hear was the wind outside and the faint rustling of leaves. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, and she eventually drifted back to sleep, chalking it up to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness. When dawn broke, the couple emerged from their tent to start their day. The air was cool, and the sun was just beginning to peek over the canyon walls, casting long shadows on the ground. But as they looked around, something immediately caught their attention, something strange. Small, childlike handprints covered the sides of their car, the canvas of their tent, and even the ground around their campsite. The prints were fresh, as if someone had just touched them moments before. At first, they thought it might have been a prank. Maybe some kids had wandered into the area overnight. But that didn't make sense. The canyon was too remote for anyone to be out there, and the nearest hiking trail was miles away. The handprints were too distinct to ignore. They were small, no more than a child's size, and the fingers were spread wide, as though they had been pressed into the surfaces with force. The prints on the tent seemed to come from the inside, like someone had placed their hands on the fabric and pressed out, as if trying to peek inside. The ones on the car were smudged, as though someone had leaned against it, leaving behind greasy prints. Megan's heart began to race. She looked at Jeff, and he was as equally disturbed by what they were seeing. Neither of them had heard a thing during the night. No footsteps, no rustling around the tent. Nothing. Who the hell could have done this? Jeff whispered, his voice tight with unease. They quickly checked the rest of the campsite. There were no footprints leading to or from their tent. No signs of anyone else having been there. The dirt was undisturbed except for the handprints, which made no sense. They had camped in a relatively open area, and anyone who had approached their site would have left some trace. But the area was perfectly still. Megan scanned the canyon walls for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The eerie silence of the place had returned. The wind was still, and the usual sounds of wildlife seemed to have disappeared. They both knew they couldn't stay there. The unease that settled in their stomachs grew stronger by the minute. They didn't know who or what had left the prints, but they both felt an instinctive, primal fear creeping up their spines. The idea that something or someone had been so close to their camp during the night without them noticing was terrifying. After a tense few minutes of silently staring at the prints, they decided it was best to pack up and leave. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer welcome in this place, that the canyon wasn't as empty as it had seemed when they first arrived. As they hurriedly broke camp, packing everything into their car, neither of them could speak. They were too rattled, too shaken by the eerie handprints and the sudden, overwhelming sense of being watched. The trip had gone from peaceful to unsettling in a matter of hours, and they had no intention of sticking around to find out what was responsible for the strange discovery. When they finally started the car and drove away, Megan couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing in the distance, watching them leave. But the canyon remained still, as it had always been, the handprints fading from sight as they drove farther away. Neither of them spoke of the incident again. It remained a mystery, one they couldn't quite explain, but both of them knew that they would never forget the sight of those small, childlike handprints, so innocent, yet so unsettling, marked on the sides of their car and tent. As they drove home, the sense of unease stayed with them. They couldn't shake the feeling that the canyon held something dark, something that had watched them from the shadows, something that had left its mark. Story 6. The Singing Woman. It was early autumn when Greg, a seasoned solo camper, decided to escape the busy city life for a weekend in the Pacific Northwest. He'd always been drawn to the quiet beauty of the riverbanks, the misty mornings, and the towering pine trees. For this trip, he selected a secluded camping spot along a winding river deep in the woods, far from any trails and only accessible by a narrow, rugged path. Greg had camped alone before, and the isolation was something he cherished. He relished the solitude, the way the forest seemed to breathe around him, and the constant hum of the river's flow. That evening, after a long day of hiking and setting up camp, he built a small fire, lit his lantern, and settled in for a peaceful night. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned dark, the forest grew quiet, save for the distant sound of the river. He sat back in his camp chair, sipping his tea, letting the stillness of the night wash over him. The forest felt alive in a way that was comforting and humbling. The chirping of crickets and rustling of leaves was all he needed to feel at home. Around midnight, as Greg sat by the fire, something odd caught his attention. A sound, a faint melody, drifting through the trees. It was a woman's voice, soft and haunting, singing an old folk song. The melody was strange, almost eerie, as if it had traveled through time itself. At first, Greg thought it might be someone nearby, another hiker or camper enjoying a late-night tune. But the voice was too clear, too close, and yet too distant, like it was both near and far at the same time. He strained his ears to listen, but the song would fade whenever he tried to pinpoint its source. It felt like the wind itself was carrying the voice, teasing him with its haunting rhythm, only to vanish the moment he moved in its direction. Greg stood up, curiosity piqued. He grabbed his flashlight and slowly walked toward the edge of the riverbank where the sound seemed to be coming from. The night air was cool, and the forest around him was unnervingly still. The moonlight barely pierced through the thick canopy of trees. He swept the beam of his flashlight across the river and the surrounding underbrush, but there was nothing, just shadows and silence. The voice continued, softer now, but still there, drifting like a whisper from the trees. He stopped in his tracks, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was as if the forest itself had paused, listening, waiting. The voice was no longer just a sound. It had become a presence. He thought about calling out, but something held him back. Instead, he listened, drawn to the melody that seemed to beckon him further into the woods. After a few moments, the voice ceased altogether, leaving nothing but the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Greg stood there for a long time, wondering if he had imagined it. He retraced his steps back to the camp, shaking off the strange feeling that had crept into his bones. As the night deepened, Greg couldn't shake the sensation that he was being watched. The voice never returned, but the silence that followed felt unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. He tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, the image of a woman singing in the distance came to him, her voice both sorrowful and serene. Morning came, and Greg awoke with the first light of dawn filtering through the trees. He felt a strange heaviness in his chest, a mix of awe and unease. He packed up his camp with a lingering sense of discomfort, wondering if the night had been a product of his imagination. But the eerie melody stayed with him as he walked back to the trailhead, each step feeling heavier than the last. A few days later, while stopping for supplies in a small town near the forest, Greg found himself talking to some locals about his camping trip. He casually mentioned the strange singing he had heard, but before he could finish, the woman behind the counter stopped him. "Ah, you heard her, didn't you?" she said, her voice quiet but knowing. Greg nodded, unsure of how to respond. The singing woman, she continued, her face serious. "People hear her from time to time, especially those camping near the river. It's said she's a spirit, wandering the woods, singing her songs." Greg's eyes widened. He'd never heard anything like this before. "They say she used to live here long ago. A woman who loved the river and would sing to the trees. But one winter, she disappeared and no one knows what happened to her. Some say she drowned. Others say she was lost to the forest. But ever since then, people who camp near the river hear her singing at night." Greg felt a chill run down his spine. "Don't worry," the woman added, her tone lightening. "She's not dangerous. Just a ghost who can't leave the forest. But if you ever hear her again, you'll know it's her. No one else sings like that." Greg left the store feeling unsettled. He had been certain that he hadn't imagined the singing, and now it made sense. There was something more to it than just an eerie coincidence. Whether it was the spirit of the woman or something else, Greg would never know for sure, but he never camped near that river again. Story 7. The Unexplainable Lights. It was the kind of night that made the Mojave Desert feel both beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The moon hung like a silver lantern in the sky, casting faint light over the dry, cracked earth, and the wind whispered across the barren landscape, carrying the scent of sagebrush. A group of 4 friends, Jake, Laura, Mike, and Sophie, had been hiking through the desert for a few days, camping under the stars and enjoying the serenity of the wilderness. Their campsite was set up on a slight rise overlooking a vast stretch of sand and scrub. They had planned to watch the stars for a while before heading to bed. After all, the Mojave Desert was known for its clear skies, making it an excellent spot for stargazing. As they sat around the campfire, laughing and sharing stories. The night grew deeper, and the world around them seemed to fall into a kind of stillness. The fire crackled and popped, casting long, dancing shadows on the desert floor. Then Mike, the most observant of the group, noticed something strange. "Hey, you guys," Mike said, pointing toward the horizon. "Look over there." The others turned to follow his gaze. At first, all they saw was the usual desert landscape, a stretch of flat, sandy terrain punctuated by low hills and jagged rock formations. But then, they noticed something that didn't belong. A series of small, glowing orbs appeared just above the horizon. At first, they looked like distant headlights from a vehicle far off in the distance. The orbs glowed a soft white, faintly pulsing as though they were trying to break through the night's darkness. But as they watched, the lights began to move erratically. They didn't follow a straight line or stay in one place, as headlights would. Instead, they darted in random directions, almost as if they were searching for something. Jake squinted, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it's just some other campers or a jeep driving by, he suggested, his voice uncertain. "That's a pretty big area out there." Laura nodded. "Yeah, maybe. But why would they be driving around this time of night?" The lights continued to shift, zigzagging across the horizon with a speed and agility that seemed unnatural. They moved in sudden, sharp angles, and some of them would hover for a moment before darting off in another direction, as though they were alive. Sophie stood up and stepped closer to the edge of the campsite. "I don't know, guys," she said, her voice a little shaky. "That doesn't look like any vehicle I've ever seen, and there's no road out there for anyone to be driving on." The others stood, joining her at the campsite's edge, staring at the lights. A heavy silence fell over the group as they watched, mesmerized and unnerved by what they were seeing. The lights seemed to be aware of their gaze, shifting and moving in response, as if they were observing the campers from a distance. "I've heard about strange lights in the desert," Jake finally said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "People call them sky lanterns or ghost lights. Some say it's just atmospheric phenomena, but others think it's something more supernatural." Mike chuckled nervously. "You don't think this is one of those UFO stories, do you?" Before anyone could respond, the lights suddenly began to hover more erratically. One orb shot up into the sky, climbing higher and faster than any plane or helicopter could. Another darted off to the side, disappearing behind a jagged mountain ridge. The others followed suit, moving in all directions at once. "Okay, this is weird," Laura said, backing away from the edge of the campfire's light. "We need to get inside the tents now." But the group didn't move right away. Instead, they watched as the orbs danced above the desert, almost taunting them like fireflies on a massive scale. They twisted and turned in ways that seemed impossible for any human-made object, and the eerie glow made the desert around them feel even more desolate and lonely. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights began to fade. One by one, they blinked out, vanishing into the night without a trace. The desert, which had felt so alive with energy just moments before, returned to a quiet, unnerving stillness. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, deepening the sense of isolation that hung over them. Where did they go? Sophie asked in a hushed voice, almost afraid to hear the answer. I don't know, Jake said, his voice tight. But I don't think we're supposed to know. The group stood there for a few moments longer, staring at the empty horizon. Not a sound could be heard except for the wind gently rustling the sagebrush and the occasional crackling from the fire. They all felt it, the feeling that something was wrong, that something had just happened that couldn't be explained, and it left a deep, unsettling feeling that no one could shake. Eventually, they retreated to their tents, but sleep did not come easily that night. Every creak and rustle in the desert seemed amplified. Every gust of wind felt too much like a presence lingering just outside. The strange lights had vanished, but their unsettling presence lingered in the campers' minds. The next morning, they packed up their campsite in silence. No one spoke about the lights, but no one needed to. They all knew what they had seen, and they all knew that there was no explanation that could make them feel comfortable again. As they drove away from the Mojave Desert, the desert behind them looked the same as it always had, quiet, vast, and empty. But for those 4 friends, it would never feel the same again. They had encountered something they couldn't explain, and that was enough to leave them with an unshakable feeling of unease. The lights had vanished, but the questions remained. What were they? Where had they gone? And more importantly, why had they been watching? Story 8. The cabin that shouldn't exist. It was a warm, sunny afternoon when 3 friends, Jake, Olivia, and Ben, decided to embark on a hiking trip deep into the forest. They had spent the last few months carefully planning this adventure, looking for a new trail, far from the crowds of the popular hiking spots. The path they chose was less known, tucked away in a secluded part of the mountains where few dared to venture. They relished the idea of solitude and the thrill of exploring uncharted territory. As they made their way through the dense woods, the sounds of the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. The air grew cooler as they climbed higher, the trees thickening around them. By late afternoon, they came to a clearing with a strange sight. An old cabin, partially obscured by vines and towering trees. It looked out of place, as if time had forgotten it. The cabin stood crooked, its roof sagging in spots, the walls weathered and worn by years of neglect. There was something unsettling about the structure, but curiosity pushed them forward. They set their backpacks down and walked up to the cabin, their footsteps crunching on the overgrown ground. Jake, the most adventurous of the group, was the first to step inside. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a dimly lit interior. The air smelled stale, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. The cabin was small, cluttered with old furniture that seemed to have been left behind in haste. Dust filled the air, and cobwebs hung from the corners like forgotten memories. But what struck them the most were the carvings on the walls. Strange symbols were scratched into the wooden beams and walls, some resembling animal figures, others more abstract, like runes or hieroglyphs. There was an eerie quality to them, as though they were meant to tell a story, one that was not meant to be told. The symbols were jagged, sharp, and unsettling, as if carved in a hurry or under duress. As they explored further, They came across a fireplace with a pile of fresh ashes, still warm to the touch. The presence of recent fires seemed out of place in a cabin so clearly abandoned. Nearby, they saw a small wooden table. To their shock, there were half-eaten meals left on the plates, a slice of bread, some fruit, and a bowl of soup that had long since grown cold. The food looked like it had been left in the middle of a meal, with no one in sight to finish it. Ben, usually the skeptical one, took a cautious step back. "This place is wrong," he muttered. "This doesn't feel right." Olivia, too, felt a rising sense of unease. The air was thick with tension, and an unsettling quiet had settled over the cabin. They all agreed it was time to leave, their curiosity fading as the strange atmosphere grew heavier. But before they could turn to head back to the door, they heard a faint sound from outside, a low thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. Frozen, they turned to each other. "Did you hear that?" Jake asked. They waited in silence, but nothing came. Their nerves were on edge, and the urge to leave intensified. They quickly exited the cabin and gathered their things. But as they stood in the clearing, the unease didn't fade. It felt like something was watching them, lingering just beyond their sight. Without saying a word, they started down the trail again, moving quickly through the woods. They didn't speak much during the walk back, each of them lost in their own thoughts about what they had just encountered. What had they found? Who had been living in that cabin? Why had they left so suddenly? The following morning, they decided to go back to the cabin, hoping to gather more information. As they made their way through the woods, the trail seemed different, as though it had changed overnight. The trees looked unfamiliar, the path winding in ways they didn't remember. The cabin was nowhere to be found. They searched for hours, retracing their steps, but the cabin had vanished. No sign of it remained, just the dense forest, as if the structure had never existed. "Where the hell is it?" Olivia asked, frustration creeping into her voice. They searched the area again, convinced that they must have missed it, but no matter how much they scoured the woods, there was no trace of the cabin. There was no sign of the overgrown path, no hint of the clearing they had stood in the day before. Ben's voice was low with dread. "It's like it never existed. We didn't imagine it, did we?" But they all knew the answer. They hadn't imagined it. They had seen the cabin. They had been inside it. And yet it was gone. The rest of their hike was a quiet and tense affair. None of them spoke much as they made their way back to their car, the forest around them feeling more oppressive with every step. They never spoke of the cabin again, though the memory of it haunted them. Later, they tried searching for the location on a map. There was no record of a cabin anywhere near the trail they had followed. There were no signs of it in any of the local hiking forums or guides. It was as though the cabin had never been there, nothing but a figment of their imagination. But the carvings, the food, the warmth of the fireplace, the unease that had settled over them, all of it was real. And the cabin, with its unsettling presence, was a mystery that still haunted them. The three friends would go on to hike many more trails in the years to come, but the memory of the cabin that shouldn't have existed never left them. And though they would never speak of it again, each one of them knew deep down that something far darker was out there in the wilderness, something that had left its mark on their lives and would forever linger in the shadows. Story 9. The Sound of Digging. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. Ben had been looking forward to escaping the noise of the city and immersing himself in the serene wilderness. He'd driven several hours to a secluded spot near the edge of a heavily wooded area, far from the trails, and set up his tent in a small clearing. It was a place he had camped before, an old favorite, and he relished the idea of solitude under the stars. That night, as the darkness of the forest surrounded him, Ben sat by the campfire and listened to the familiar sounds of the wild, the chirping of crickets, the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the distant call of an owl. After a long day of hiking, he crawled into his sleeping bag, the warmth of the fire fading as he zipped up his tent and turned off his lantern. The world outside became still, and for a while, it was as if the forest itself was asleep. Ben closed his eyes and began to drift into slumber, lulled by the rhythmic sounds of nature. Then, a noise pierced the quiet. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, just a soft, scraping sound. Ben stirred in his sleeping bag, unsure if he had imagined it. The sound came again, this time louder, and there was no mistaking it. It was the sound of something digging, the rhythmic scrape of a shovel or claws against earth echoed through the quiet night. His heart began to race, and a shiver ran down his spine. He wasn't in a part of the forest where animals typically dug. Sure, he had heard the occasional rustle of squirrels and the scratching of raccoons, but this sound was different. It was deliberate, consistent, and too loud to be an animal simply digging for food. He lay perfectly still, listening intently. The sound continued, scrape, scrape, scrape. It didn't stop for minutes, and then it came again, resuming after a brief pause. The digging was coming from somewhere not far from his tent. He strained his ears, trying to pinpoint the direction, but the noise seemed to shift, as if it were moving around him, circling the campsite. His mind raced with possibilities. Could it be another camper? Maybe someone digging a fire pit or setting up a shelter. But then, why hadn't Ben heard any voices or seen any flashlights? No one else had been in the area when he arrived, and he hadn't heard any other vehicles pull in. He considered getting out of his tent to investigate, but fear held him in place. The last thing he wanted was to face some other person, especially if they had wandered into the woods with strange intentions. He wasn't prepared to confront anyone at this hour, and his instincts told him to stay hidden. The digging continued throughout the night. Hours passed, and Ben was unable to sleep. He lay wide awake, his mind conjuring worst-case scenarios. What if someone was out there, burying something, or worse, digging a grave? The thought made him feel ill. He pulled the blanket tightly around him, trying to block out the noise, but it seemed to get louder, closer. The longer the digging continued, the more unsettling it became. By the time the first light of dawn crept into the woods, Ben was exhausted and shaken, but he knew he had to see what was causing the noise. The sound had stopped sometime in the early morning, and the forest around him was eerily silent once again. He waited a few minutes before cautiously unzipping his tent. The cool morning air hit him, but he barely noticed. His mind was focused on the strange digging sounds that had kept him awake all night. Ben stepped out into the clearing and looked around, squinting in the dim light. That's when he saw it. A large, freshly dug hole sat just a few feet away from his campsite. The edges of the hole were uneven, and the dirt had been heaped up in mounds around it. It wasn't a shallow hole either. It was deep enough to make Ben feel uneasy. At least 5 feet deep, the kind of hole you would expect someone to be digging with purpose, not for some casual search for a buried treasure or animal. But what disturbed him most was the absence of any sign of what had dug it. There were no tool marks, no shovel left behind, no animal tracks either. Nothing to indicate that the hole had been dug by a creature of the forest. The earth around it was disturbed, but there was no obvious explanation for how it had appeared. Ben took a cautious step forward, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breath quickened. What had happened here? Who or what had been digging all night? And why had they left without a trace? He knelt by the edge of the hole, examining it closely. The dirt felt soft, as though it had been disturbed recently, but there was nothing else. No smell, no lingering sign of activity. Just the hole. Ben's mind raced. He thought about packing up and leaving immediately, but something kept him from doing so. Perhaps it was the adrenaline still coursing through him from the night's events, or maybe it was his need for an explanation. He couldn't leave without figuring out what had happened here. After standing for a long while, staring down into the hole, Ben finally made the decision to leave. Whatever it was that had been out there, he wasn't about to stick around to find out more. The feeling of being watched, a feeling that had started when he first heard the digging, had never gone away, and it seemed stronger now, more pressing. Ben packed up his things as quickly as he could and left the clearing without looking back. As he made his way down the trail, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, hidden just beyond the trees, watching him. To this day, Ben never returned to that spot. The sound of digging still haunts him, and he can't help but wonder what, or who, had been digging near his campsite that night. The hole was a mystery, one that he may never solve. But the memory of the unease he felt in those woods will stay with him forever. The unnerving thing about the sound of digging is how it blends the normal with the unknown. Ben's encounter with something that made a purposeful, unexplainable disturbance in the forest suggests there are mysteries out there in nature that we may never fully understand. Sometimes, the woods aren't as peaceful as we like to think. Story 10. The Vanishing Campsite. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountain ranges. Mark, Sarah, Ethan, and Lily made their way along the well-worn trail. The four of them had been hiking together for years, drawn to the same spot deep in the woods, a secluded clearing by a river where they had camped countless times. It was their escape, their tradition. Every year, they'd hike the 6 miles to the clearing, set up camp, and spend the night around the fire, catching up on life. But this year, something felt different. As they approached the familiar part of the trail, Mark, who was leading, slowed his pace. "This doesn't feel right," he muttered, looking around at the trees that seemed to stand a little too tall and too close to the trail. Sarah, walking just behind him, glanced up, then shrugged it off. "Maybe it's just us being out of practice. It's been a whole year since we were last here." She smiled, but there was a hesitation in her voice. "Maybe," Mark said, though his gut twisted with unease. They continued walking, the crunch of their boots the only sound in the air. They were used to the trail, the way it bent around a large oak tree, then veered left toward a set of boulders before the clearing came into view. They knew exactly where they were, but when the group rounded the bend to the spot where they expected to see the clearing, they stopped dead in their tracks. It was gone. The ground where they had always set up their tents was now overgrown with thick, impenetrable underbrush. The familiar oak tree was missing, replaced by an eerie emptiness. The boulders were still there, but everything around them had changed. The clearing that had always felt like home was now nothing more than a dense thicket of brambles and vines. "What the hell?" Ethan said, his voice low and confused. "Where's the camp?" The group stood there, frozen in disbelief. Mark took a cautious step forward, brushing aside the undergrowth, but it was as though the land had swallowed the clearing whole. The familiar path leading to the river was completely obscured by the overgrowth, and the trees, once spaced evenly apart, were now so close together they created a dark, oppressive canopy. "This isn't possible," Lily said, shaking her head in disbelief. "We've been coming here for years. There's no way we've made a mistake. This is where we always camp." "But it's not," Mark said, his voice tight with worry. "Something's happened here." They fanned out, looking around for any sign that they had gone the wrong way. Ethan climbed to the top of a nearby boulder to get a better view, but when he looked down, his face went pale. "Guys, there's nothing around here. No landmarks, no trail. Just trees everywhere." Sarah's face drained of color. "This isn't just a mistake. It's like the campsite, it just vanished." They wandered around the area, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing looked familiar. The trees were unfamiliar. The rocks didn't match. It felt like they had stepped into a different world, one that didn't recognize the one they had known for so long. They even tried to retrace their steps, but the path they had followed seemed to have disappeared, swallowed up by the dense undergrowth. As night began to fall, they realized they had no choice but to make camp somewhere else. They set up tents in a small clearing they found nearby, but none of them could shake the feeling that they weren't supposed to be there. The forest, once their sanctuary, now felt oppressive, like something was watching them from the shadows. The night passed uneasily. Each of them lay awake in their tents, the sounds of the forest amplified in the quiet darkness. The wind moaned through the trees, and the distant sound of the river, once a comforting lullaby, now seemed eerie. Something about the night felt wrong, but none of them could explain why. The next morning, they packed up quickly, eager to leave the area. They made their way back down the trail, and as they passed the spot where the clearing had once been, Mark's heart skipped a beat. The spot was still overgrown, still untouched. It was as though the land had erased every trace of their campsite. Back at the trailhead, they spoke to a park ranger, hoping to get some answers. The ranger, an older man with a weathered face, listened to their story with a blank expression before he spoke. "You're not the first to report something like that," he said quietly. "Every couple of years, someone tells a similar story. A campsite that was there one year, and then it's gone the next. People think they're imagining things, but I know better. There are some places in these woods, places that don't like to be found. You were lucky to get out." Mark and the others were silent, the unease they'd felt all night now settling in their bones. They had always felt safe in the woods, but now they weren't so sure. The rangers' words echoed in their minds as they left, their footsteps heavy with the knowledge that something had changed, and they were never meant to understand it. Years later, they would return to the area, but they never found the clearing again. The trail was still there, the woods still thick with trees, but the place where they had camped was as if it had never existed, vanished into the shadows of the forest, never to be found again. Some places, it seemed, simply refused to be remembered,